Thank you for having your trust in me and not in how to program robots to how to learn the robots to code. Was it? I've seen how people code. I'm not pretty sure in how robots are going to produce something that's useful. How is your conference going so far? Very good. Have you heard all of the QA/automation folklore about how you have to automate everything, how you have to containerize it, how you have to make it in the cloud, how you have to kick this fucking QA because he's wasting your time and money? Yeah? This was a moment of epiphany. Probably they signal it in some manner like this. All right. Yeah, it was a divine intervention, the voice from above. Yeah, so I'm one of these people who are wasting companies' money on building useless stuff like making their products work. Not only I'm doing this, I'm actually that good that people are inviting me to hire more people that can effectively waste their money on quality and working software. So the story behind this talk actually starts with me joining the company that I'm currently working for. It's called Clippings. And the journey that I had writing UI tests, I am not pretending to be a UI automation expert. And I have a very lucky day today. And the only thing that I can guarantee is that I sort of put together all the hassle that I've went through, and I just wanted to share it with you. So if you can take anything out of it and apply it in whatever context you're working at, it will be probably very beneficial for you. So as I said, I tend to think that I'm not an automation expert. I started interviewing people that I believed were automation experts. And I found out that I'm maybe a little bit of an automation expert, not quite sure. So the concept of hindsight lessons, probably a little bit of a buggy definition in your head. I really hate people who put definitions from Wikipedia in their slides, so I decided to make mine with definitions from Urban Dictionary, which are a little bit more funny. So a hindsight normally is a lesson that we get in looking back. Normally, it's a lesson that we only realize after we screw up something really bad. And so far, it really sounds like dealing with automation, isn't it? Like, it's always try and error and trial and error and trial and error until you either get out of your mind or make it work eventually for a while. So I really love the way that people speaking at conference always put this stuff like a recipe, like the recipe for success. You just configure this thing here and run your test there, and it will work happily ever after, which normally never happens. So I decided to tease a little bit on this, and I presented my agenda as ingredients for a cake. So for the base, I like to build my presentation from the base up, normally from some basic concept. I decided to include a couple of few key concepts, which will be very important. If you don't get them right, you'll probably run into a lot of problems. One important distinction and one scrambled term. We'll see which one is this. And for the topping, we will have selectors. We are in the UI, of course. You have selectors, page objects, speed, which is actually very important, and flakes. We inevitably have flakes. And all of this sprinkled with inappropriate jokes and memes eventually, if we get to that part. As I said, I am doing wasting money, companies' money, on useless stuff like quality, and I hire another useless people to waste money. And I'm currently working for a company which is a startup. So they decided that they want to waste their money up front, so they don't have to grow because they will have more money and they will have to spend them. It will be actually a bit harder. And as you probably noticed so far, I'm a little bit of an allergic to bullshit, so I don't like the common misconceptions that people are throwing at conferences, and I'm trying to battle with them. So a little bit of an overview how your job as an automation person looks like. There's a developer, the developer creates code. This code has to be tested, obviously. As we said, we want to be very effective in wasting companies' money. And we decide to create code to test their code. Now, this is a little bit of an inception moment. Like, I know how code written by other people looks like. I know what kind of problem it has. And I am not very confident in what my code would look like. Therefore, it's a bit of an unpleasant moment when I have to say this in front of a room full of QA and testing people. But if you are writing code to test another person's code, practically you're a developer. And normally that's the reaction that you get from a bunch of QAs when you tell them they're a developer. They're like, no, why are you calling me the developer? It's them, it's the dark side. It's like, we don't do this, they're lazy, and they don't write tests, and they are, yeah. But unfortunately, you're a developer, and if you don't realize this, if you don't approach your job as a QA person writing tests, you're probably a lazy developer, a developer which is very deluded about what they're doing. And even the fact is that maybe you need even more attention. Like if a developer needs to write tests and do code reviews and pair with people in order to like organize their code to be sane and useful, you, as a novice person in development, will probably need more of this and invest more in this. So you even have to invest a little bit more. So, 3 hard-to-figure concepts. Many times when I was asked by people to give them some sort of advice how to deal with an automation problem, it turns out that they are facing either an organizational problem or some sort of theoretical problem that they couldn't figure out, and they have totally screwed misconception about testing. Maybe some of you saw these, and maybe some of you didn't. It's a quadrant of how your knowledge normally spreads. In the upper left corner, you have what you know, and some part of it is the wrong part. Of course, we are all human, we are all making mistakes. This is the part that we are competent in. This is our zone of comfort, and stuff like this. We also have the part of our knowledge which we know we don't know. Like, for example, I know I'm totally incompetent in, I don't know, Latino dances. Like, probably I would look like a stick with legs or something if I try Latino dances. And there's a huge part which normally goes infinitely, the huge part of what we don't know. Now, your automation lives in the upper left corner, and this is the only part that you are able to automate. This is only facts that you already know. This is the reason why normally we are calling it fact-based checking instead of test automation, because when we speak about testing, we normally speak about exploration. And what we cherish in testing is normally learning new information that can uncover something which is something that we don't know about the product. Why do we want to uncover this information? Because surprises are normally something that we don't like. Even surprise actually is a word that we're using for something that's a happy surprise. If it's not a happy surprise, we call it a different manner, a problem. So our exploration is actually trying to pull the boundaries of what we already know towards the boundaries, and also the boundaries of what we don't know, towards the vast barrens of what we don't know. So if you decide to live only in that little square here, you will probably have a very, very miserable life as a tester. If you decide to only live here, you probably miss some part which can already verify in some manner. So I'd say that you probably have to explore both and try to expand both. So the other messed up misconception is the purpose of automating. Many people believe that the purpose of automating is just automating interactions in the browser or in the API or whatever. But if we take a look at some examples of successful automation, something that's in our life day in and day out, something that we use to such extent that we take them for granted, they are not actually automating interactions. Like, for example, the car is not automating the carriage in a way that if it was automating the carriage, the horse carriage, for example, we would have robotic horses that would just pull the carriage. It's using the technology, it's using the same principle, it's facing the same end goal, but it's approaching it in a little bit different manner. It's the same for planes, for example. Planes don't flap their wings. They're looking like birds, they're flying like birds, but they don't flap their wings because they don't have to. We are having kind of a hard time figuring out this in testing because we keep doing these end-to-end tests that are repeating user interactions if we are trying to repeat the actions of the user one by one, step by step. Everything very, very explicitly, and this is something that I'm normally referring to as over-anthropomorphization, like trying to make your tests look very, very human, even when they don't have to. So the automation itself, it's not the goal, it's actually trying to achieve higher efficiency and add value to our testing by the means of technology. So when you're thinking about your test automation, try to make it, or your automated fact-based checking, try to make it efficient, not try to make it replicating whatever you have. The last one is the so-called end-to-end testing. Most of you are probably writing end-to-end tests. Most of you are probably using this term. Most of you are probably hearing and listening about lectures about end-to-end testing. But I have a problem with the term end-to-end testing. And as I said, I don't tend to be an expert. I just tend to try stuff. And if they work for me, I share them with other people. What normally people imagine when they speak about end-to-end tests, they imagine the entry point of the system. Let's say it's an e-commerce application. You have the entry point of the system, which is a landing page or a login, a registration form, whatever. You have different steps where you can purchase stuff, add them to your basket, browse them, do some stuff like them, verify prices and stuff. And the exit point, which is like payment or some sort of confirmation message or whatever. So what they imagine when they speak about end-to-end tests, they are imagining doing some sort of testing to all of the flow, like beginning in the top part, doing all the stuff that are in the middle, and checking out, for example, or making a successful order. Now, the problems with this is that you have a lot of complexity in creating such a large test. If you're trying to automate these tests, they normally become very large, they become very unreliable, they become dependent on a lot of different criteria. One of them is the flows. You're practically automating the user journey, which means if in our modern day agile DevOps world where changes are introduced constantly, and somebody decides to change the user flow, you actually run into a lot of problems and you have to adapt them day in and day out. Also, as I said, they are very over-anthropomorphic. They're too human-like. Like, we don't want to do this because we just want to use technology in an efficient way. For example, if you're having a test that represents a different user, logging in, picking one item, checking it out, logging in, picking another item, checking it out, and you're using your navigation bar every time. What are you doing? You're actually repeating actions. If your navigation bar breaks, you have your test breaking for a reason which is not actually reliable to the one thing that you're trying to test. And also, these tests seem to test a lot of stuff. They are too distracted between different concerns. As I said, they are very tied to user flow, which makes them very brittle, and brittle tests are unreliable. And we'd rather have no tests than having unreliable tests, because unreliable tests are sort of a lying shepherd story. Once they start screaming wolf too often, people start to ignore them, they forget to run them, they try to skip them, they skip their pre-commit hooks and stuff like this. What I believe is useful instead is what I would refer to as inversion of the ends, which means instead of thinking about end-to-end testing as having an entry point in the application and having an exit point in the application and trying to automate user flows, think of your end-to-end as your full stack, full technology stack. The purpose of end-to-end test is in fact to make like a bite-sized test like this burger. That's the reason for choosing a burger. A bite-sized test which tries to experience that each and every part of your full stack, of your technical stack, is behaving okay with each other. The reason for this is that your tests become very smaller, much smaller. They become much more reliable. They're not depending on a lot of stuff that are outside of their concerns. They're much more focused on single actions or on single checks that they're performing, and they will be much less painful for dealing with them. So here's how like the steps of a test would look like before and after the inversion of the ends. Like if you have the classical end-to-end test, it would normally look like you have the prerequisite that you have to create or choose the test user, you have to log it in, you normally go to the navigation bar, go to catalog, pick up an item, verify what the prices are, you add it to basket, you navigate to the basket, you check out, you verify that, for example, successful order was placed, or that successful message was shown, or whatever. Now, there's a couple of different stuff that are wrong in scenario like this. There's too many steps, there's too many dependencies, there's too many checks. A lot of stuff can go wrong here. What I do and how I approach it on the other hand, is we put all of the stuff that we normally want to be like a pre-setup in the prerequisites. So, for example, if we're wanting to test the checkout, we will only focus on the checkout. So the beginning, the entry point of our test will be going to the checkout. And all of the other stuff, all of the collateral stuff will be set up as part of the, for example, before method or setup method or whatever method you have in your automation framework. So all of these would normally be created by some sort of additional tool. We don't use UI to set up data in our database. We don't use, because it's very slow. It's also very brittle. So what I recommend is try to use some sort of internal tool or negotiate with your developers an internal tool that will help you set up the state of the application in a manner that you can perform your tests from a specific point, performing one action or two actions, and assert the outcome. It's a very good heuristic to make sure if your tests are short enough and meaningful enough. If your test has more than 3 or 4 steps, there's practically something wrong with it, and it's probably going to be very, very hard to maintain. Most of you heard about flaky tests, and if you don't get the previous part right, you will probably run into flaky tests. It's very easy to have flaky tests in UI. It's like the nature of UI is such that it's very easy to have flaky tests, and there's various different reasons why would we have flaky tests. And by definition, a flaky test is a test that normally has an inconsistent behavior. It has a behavior that either fails without a reason or fails without a reason in the code that's committed with the specific test, or it fails, then passes, then fails, then passes. It has inconsistent behavior. And as I said, it's even worse than having no test because they're providing false information. So, in definition, our flaky test is in fact not doing the job that it's supposed to do. So, going back to the concept that I started with, that we are after all developers, and what we are doing is developing code, in fact, by definition, our flaky test is a bug. So it's more accurate to call it a buggy test because it's not doing, the code that we wrote in our test is not doing what its purpose is. What are the reasons for having flaky tests? I organized them in like the most obvious to the less obvious. And the first most obvious reason, as I said, is the nature of UI. Like, it's called user interface for a reason because it has to be used by a user. And your automation scripts are not a user. Wow. It has a lot of brittle stuff in the UI, and there's a lot of stuff that we don't figure out until we start automating it. For example, what's the sequence of loading of components? If something is clickable before it's visible, or if it's visible before it's clickable, you will run into a lot of these. And they are very brittle, and they are normally something that's out of your test, but you have to account for them and make your test like work around them. The test composition, as I said, if your tests are too long or too dependent on outer states or something that you can't control, or on something that you can control but you don't do it, they will also turn your tests into flaky, buggy, non-consistent, failing, and so on. Large classes and large methods normally are a problem, and that's the reason why I'm not a very huge fan of end-to-end tests in their classical manner, because normally they're doing way too much stuff. Like if you ever heard about good practices in programming, like single responsibility principle, for example, if you're doing a test that's logging in and navigating and clicking and adding and checking out and checking this and checking this, this is definitely not single responsibility. It's like a bunch of responsibilities in it. Wrong assumptions about the software, that's normally stuff that we have to figure out why we are thinking about our testing, why we're designing them, why we're exploring. That's the reason why I said that we cannot have one without the other. We cannot just live in the small box of what we already have and know. We have to expand it, otherwise we will run into wrong assumptions, and wrong assumptions lead to wrong tests. Getting ahead of yourself means that normally in the need for speed that we have in our day-to-day jobs, we are eager to make our tests a little bit more brittle, a little bit more fast in order to make them run faster, because if you have no automation, people will complain that you have no automation. If you create automation, people will complain that your automation is slow. And this is how it goes. So we try to cut corners. We try to make stuff click whenever they appear. We try to make stuff fill forms way faster than a user, which is a problem itself because this is not the regular behavior of a regular user. So we are doing this stuff in order to make our tests run faster. Configuration, well, stuff like this happen all the time. You're running your Selenium tests on your local machine, you see the window, and you go to run them on the Travis or the Jenkins or whatever headless browser environment, and turns out that the headless browser has a different resolution than your machine, and your tests start breaking because you didn't account for running them in headless. And of course, the worst is not knowing what the fuck you're doing, meaning you have to understand what testing is about. And whatever I'm seeing very often at conferences and people speaking about UI testing is a very good development-oriented people, understanding very well the tool, understanding very well the coding concepts, but knowing nothing about what testing is about and what the qualities of testing are. So how do I use this in practice? I'm not going to show any live coding. I'm not a huge fan of live coding. Instead, I will show a couple of snippets from the framework that we are writing. And they're organized in the following pattern. This is a mnemonic coined by Richard Bradshaw. Richard and Mark are two guys that are working in the so-called automation in testing space, namespace. If you're interested in learning more about what testing automation is and how to perform quality testing automation, I really, really recommend their namespace. They're really, really cool guys and have a lot of wisdom in this area. So your test should be sacred, and by this I don't mean any spiritual stuff. I'm not going to summon a demon or something, but each of these letters has a meaning behind them. S stands for state management. Your tests have to manage some sort of state. You have to make sure that your tests are always starting from a specific state. Actions that you perform, and rather than, I prefer if the actions that are performed in our tests are limited to only one or two actions, not doing a lot of stuff, because a lot of stuff, like the more actions you have, the more, the bigger the possibility to break something. You need some sort of a codified oracle. Oracles in testing are normally a concept about having an entity which verifies the information that we have, and we need to have this in our automated checks as well. That's the reason that we have to understand testing. Otherwise, we will just check for some obvious stuff. Reporting is something quite vital for our test, especially in CI/CD environment. Like if you're running your tests on every commit, or on every pull request, or on every change in your code, you don't want your reporting to be such that you have to go and investigate in your test. Like your test should be very specific and deterministic in what failed. Like if you have a test that's called checking out with a Visa card, which only has one action, which is practically checking out, clicking on the button checkout and inputting a Visa card number, you will really understand what went wrong if it fails. Like your payment with Visa cards doesn't work. But if you have a test which is like, I am logging in and I'm buying this and I'm adding it to the basket and I'm checking its price and I'm doing this and this and this and that, when it fails, you will be lost and you will have to go and investigate and invest time in trying to figure out what went wrong. Execution is the part of your test that you have to figure out whether or not you're going to execute them weekly, bi-weekly, daily, nightly, and believe me, there's a lot of stuff that you have to account for here. For example, how are you going to set up your data? whether or not it's going to be pre-populated or you're going to populate it on the fly time. And there's a lot of interesting stories here, which probably deserve a separate lecture themselves. And of course, deterministic. Your test should be very deterministic and very specific when it fails and when it passes. And mixing those two normally leads to a lot of confusion. So a little bit of a context. What the application and the company that I'm working for, obviously they are brave enough to hire me, wasting their money, as we figured out. But they're a platform for interior designers. The part that you're going to see will make it look more like an e-commerce application for you, which is completely normal. We have the e-commerce part, so if you want, you can have your... You can just buy chairs and sofas and stuff like this and check out, it's okay. But the part that we are trying to be useful with is organizing interior design projects in our platform. It's built with PHP backend, so the services that we are running are PHP. We have React frontend, which poses an interesting challenges for us and for automating. And of course, we have the dreaded, terrible legacy code, which even for a company which is like 4 or 5 years old is already a fact. Not that we have some such terrible old framework that we're using, but moving very fast and trying to grow very fast. Lots of the methods and approaches and frameworks that you're using get discontinued or get thrown away, or you decide to move to anything else and you get this bulk of incomplete stuff that you're still dealing with in your code, which also is an interesting thing to deal with. The testing environment, we use a tool called Codeception. I made a presentation about its API part last year. I'm going to be speaking about the UI part. I know that it's not polite to show pornography from the stage, but I have to show some PHP code, so you know. You're warned now. Yeah, I'm fucking a lot with PHP, but it's just a programming language. Like I've seen people do stupid stuff in any language practically. We are using Travis for our CI, and we are running our environment in Vagrant. So, a little bit about page objects. Is there anyone not knowing what a page object design pattern is? Okay, a couple of you. So, just to let you know, a page object design pattern is a design pattern which is probably the most popular in UI automation, trying to map whatever you have on the page to an object in your code. So, it's just a nice way to organize what is concern of your page and what is concern of your test, not mixing those and make your code a little bit more neat and organized. What we have in our page objects normally is the element locators, the element handlers. This is methods that we use, and optional eventually the custom assertions. I have to make a little bit of a clarification here. In the PHP implementation, the Facebook PHP implementation of WebDriver, we don't have the page factory. Therefore, you won't see me using the @ sign with like find by or something like this. We are normally passing just strings as selectors, and that's the only specific. We also don't have the loadable component, so we have to work around loading of different components in a little bit of a different manner. About locators, it's all fun and games, and I'm always loving these lectures on conferences when people are showing, automating the Google page and searching for something and asserting that something is shown in the Google result. It's very wonderful. Nobody does this except Google probably, I don't know, but probably it's even boring for them. And it's all fun and games until you have to run in something like this. And you have to take some data out of the table written probably 10 years ago by somebody in a moment when they didn't want to work a lot, or they just wanted to wave it and make it like go away, or you have to deal with custom React components. I'm not a React specialist and I'm not so deep into React, but I've dealt with it for 2 projects so far. And as far as I know, you can do lots of weird stuff in React. For example, you can build custom components like something that looks like a button, but it's not a button, which is okay. It looks very cool. It looks very shiny, but Selenium has a problem with it. So a little bit of do's and don'ts. If your locators look like this, the red one, that's red beauty, it's definitely a red light for something going wrong. You're in a really deep shit if your selectors look like this. Try to forget about content-based locators. Anything that's on your page is not a concern of what your test should do. Try to base them on some sort of a uniqueness. I will go into this part a little bit later. Try not to rely on classes. Your favorite front-end developer or favorite designer will probably go and replace classes, and that will break your tests, and you'll cry, and they will and you'll probably have problems with them. And try to leave pseudo-selectors like last child, first child, end child out of the box unless you really, really need them. Like put them in the that glass door and only break it if you have to do it. Try to make your selector based on uniqueness, like ID, name, ARIA label sometimes can even work for you. Try to make it as good as possible, as unique as possible, and that would guarantee you that you probably won't have to replace it each and every time that somebody commits code in this file. Try to replace strict inheritance with like relative inheritance, because otherwise, if any element is inserted between these two, parent and child, they will probably break your tests. Try to speak with your devs. I have this question when I go to interviews and I ask people, what would you do if you have to automate a form that has no unique IDs, or like a login form that has no unique IDs, or IDs are generated automatically? And normally they start giving me these complex selectors that they will use XPaths and stuff like this, and I'm like, dude, just go ask your developer, can you help me in some manner? Can you add an ID here? Can you add some sort of data test ID or something like this? And it might actually work. Like they probably can say screw you and get rid of you, but if it works, it's actually very useful, and that's an example of data test IDs that we are adding. Recently, we found out that React has a way to strip this in case you don't want to commit them to your production because they're not needed there. So if you're automating a SPA application, your tests will normally, or whatever you're trying to figure out will normally look like this, or this, or this, because you have these spinners. And you know, it was easy. It was not easy, actually. It was terrible back in the days when you have to reload all the page, but now it's even more terrible because you have all these fragments loading at a separate time. And as I said, in PHP version of Selenium, the PHP port of Selenium, we don't have the loadable component or page factory, so we don't have something out of the box to deal with it. But I came out with an idea which probably might be useful for some of you, which I call element handlers. And element handlers is small functions that sole responsibility is to handle some sort of interaction with an element. For example, we have element handler for clicking a button, for writing in a field, for making some action on a field, whatever it is. And normally, within this element handler, we will also make sure that the button is visible or that the component is visible, interactable, and stuff like this. This is a little bit of a cheat from the single responsibility principle, but it's a needful cheat, because if we have to deal with loading components each and every time we are going into our test, it will probably be a terrible mess. We will have to do it in many separate places. We will have to repeat code. And this way, for example, if I see that my button is not loaded, I know that I have to go and tinker into the element handler and make sure it works fine. Why element handler? Well, it's practically a single point of management where your elements are being used and whether or not they are being loaded. It can actually help us handle a little bit of a complex UI, and I'll show you an example of this. And it actually lets you think about actions. It also helps you kind of abstract what you're doing in the user interface in terms of actions. As I said, a little bit of pornography. This is a couple of examples of an element handler. The scenario that we are automating here is practically just making a comment into our comment section. Like, as you saw, we have this shop. You can pick something, cut it to your project, and you can go to the item and discuss with your account manager about whether or not you like it. You want it in this color or not. It practically looks just like comments in Facebook, really like comments in Facebook. So, for example, we have a handler called writing comment field, which is making sure that the field is clickable, the field is visible, and it feels filled. We have the send comment, which is practically just pressing key. We don't have the button. We only do it with the enter key. And we have also a handler for emoji, which is kind of a magical one because dealing with emojis is a little bit of a mess. But we have it as a test case, so they decided they want it to work this way. So a bit of a complex UI. This beauty is part of our legacy code, part of our legacy frameworks that we're using. And it's actually very wonderful for automating. Most of you that dealt with automation probably will love it because of these loaders that appear, but most likely because of the sliding of the accordion and the buttons sliding themselves up and down, which, as you can imagine, Selenium handles in a marvelous manner. It will throw you exceptions that you're trying to click on this button, but it's moved upward, so you're clicking on something else, and it will probably be cursing and trying and cursing and trying until you figure it out. So what we can do is create another element handler, which can deal with this sort of animation. As I said, it's kind of a cheat, but it's a useful cheat because otherwise you will be cursing and swearing, and it's not a good end for you. So you will be making sure first that we have the whole form animated, so we'll probably attach to some CSS style to make sure that it's complete, animated, expanded, whatever it is. We will make sure that we see one option, we will make sure that we see the other options so that they are rendered properly on the page, and we will perform the click and make sure it's happening. The wonderful thing about these handlers is that we can actually chain them in a manner that we can create more complex action. Like, if I want to write a comment, the comment would normally look like, for a user, it's single action, I write a comment. But if I am a machine, if I am a Selenium script, I would like to actually perform a couple of things, like going to the comment field, writing something in it, clicking on a button to send the comment, or clicking on enter key to send the comment. And normally, I decided that these don't belong to the page object because it's not natural. Like, normally we wouldn't say something like the comment page is sending a comment. We would say normally like the user is sending a comment from the comment page. So I decided that these need to be put into an actor class. So actors are normally performing actions on page objects. The reason for this is a talk by Anthony Marciano from a couple of years at Selenium London. It's a very provoking, thought-provoking talk, so I believe it will be useful for you. I added the link to the blog topic that they started with this, but I believe it has link for the presentation as well. So how a more complex action would look like, so it would practically just chain element handlers. So for example, write a comment would look like writing a comment and sending a comment. Write many comments will be just doing one of these into a loop, etc. So how the test look like? The test would normally be very, very explicit in what they're doing, which is a good thing. As I said, we're trying to first decouple our testing logic from our page logic. We are also trying to decouple what we are performing as actions from the implementation that we're having, and that's something quite useful when you're dealing with a lot of changes. So as you see, we have also emoji test to make sure that the emoji is displayed. I have to rush up a little bit because I'm a little bit of an overtime maybe. So a few key takeaways that will make probably your test better, even if you a starter, even if you spent a while in test automation or test automated checking. The first thing is large tests. Like we have certain test smells, like just like the code smells that developers are seeing. We have certain test smells that can lead us to understand that something's wrong with our tests. First thing is large tests, large classes. Like there's a concept that a large class is everything that's bigger than your head. Like I don't literally put my head to the screen to make sure that my classes are not too large, but whenever you see the possibility to split something into partial page objects or pull some part of the logic into additional class and insert it or inject it into your classes, this might be actually very useful in a manner to manage your code better or faster or have less operative cost for dealing with your code. As I said, try to separate your page logic from your test logic. Try to decouple your test logic from your implementation in a manner that you don't have like selector flying into your test. You don't have weights in your test. All of these could be handled in element handlers or some similar function that would do something like this. Many of you probably heard about solid principle. Many of you probably didn't. If you never did and you're a coder, I believe that at least the first two principles, the single responsibility and the open cause principle, will be very useful in creating code that is going to be resilient to changes and working in your environment. So that's practically it.
Thank you, Viktor. Some questions?
Okay, if you are around, just ping me. If you have any interesting questions, just...
Sorry, Viktor. I have one, if I may.
Yeah.
Correct. First of all, very good presentation.
Thank you.
And I have a question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you used in your code implicit weights?
No. Here's the thing with PHP implementation and the codeception. They kind of sugarize a lot of the code of Selenium. So, for example, weights there they don't have the three type of weights that Selenium has: the implicit, explicit, and fluent weights. They only have the implicit and explicit. The fluent weight is achieved by another means, which is called step decorators, but that's irrelevant up until now. So these weights are practically, which one you said, implicit or explicit?
Implicit, I think.
No, these are explicit because they're waiting for some certain condition to happen. So practically, they have methods like iWait for element visible, which means that they're checking if something is visible and then proceeding down the code or waiting for a certain amount of time. But they don't have this flexibility, for example, giving to the test proper step or interval at which it will check, which will probably make it a little bit more optimized.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.